Hey, so we know about famous people in history because usually they either wrote about what they did because they were literate, or someone else at the time wrote about what they did because they were rich or famous. Usually both. They're literate and rich or powerful. So we have no problem finding information about those people. But the question is, and here's some examples. Of people in U.S. history that we have no problem finding what their experience was because they wrote about it. Um, However, there are a lot of people in history who aren't famous, who couldn't write, and so we can't just read what they had to say. We can't read about their experience because they didn't write about it. And nobody else wrote about it because nobody thought they were important. So we're talking about farmers, laborers, servants, craftsmen, tailors, mothers, fathers. How do we find out about these people? Um, One way we find out about them is by reading documents that tell us indirectly about them. So we're talking about tax records, birth and death records, census records. Um, Today we're going to look at passenger lists from ships that sailed from England to the northern colonies. And specifically, we're going to look at a passenger list from a ship that sailed to the Chesapeake colonies, so here like in the Virginia area, and then another ship that sailed to the New England colonies, up in the northern colonies. So let's take a look at the first passenger list and see what it tells us. So this ship was called the America, and you'll have a chance to look at the list later in an assignment. But here's a view of it, and I went through and added up all of the ages and found the average to be 23 and a half. So the average age of a passenger on this ship was 23 and a half years old. I also, and you can tell just by looking at this list, there are way more men than women. In this list they separated, so the men are listed first and then the women second. There are way more men than women on this ship. And then also, if you take a close look, you'll see that most people don't have the same name, the same last name. And so we can see that generally they weren't traveling as families. Okay, so now let's look at the other passenger list. This is from the Planter, and this ship was traveling to New England. And if you take so again, I added up the ages and found the average to be 27. So the average age on this ship was 27 years old. I also noticed that there are approximately the same amount of men as there are women. And just when you get to the assignment and it asks you about men versus women on these ships, it's true that now it's hard to tell someone's gender based on their name. Because we use a lot of different names nowadays, different spellings. But back then the names were pretty standard, pretty traditional male and female names. So you can assume that if it's a traditional female name, then it was a female. And same with male. So I noticed there's a balance on this ship. Also, I noticed there are several families, so people with the last name. So for example, the Beardsleys down here. You have Marie Beardsley, another Marie Beardsley, 4 years old, so probably her daughter, a John Beardsley, a Joseph Beardsley, and a William Beardsley. So like I would just guess that Mason and Marie were married, and those three, Marie, John, and Joseph, were their children. And then also this passenger list shows some of their occupations. So for example, here's servant, three servants. And then down here, there's a farmer, a shoemaker, and a tailor. So on this ship, there are families, people with a skill or trade, servants. So let's compare the two. On the America, traveling to Chesapeake, you have a bunch of young people, mostly men, so a bunch of young men who aren't related to each other. And on the Planter, you have older people on average, and it's spread out. It's kind of even between men and women, and then families, a bunch of families. And then you also have servants and tradespeople, farmers and uh, tailors and things like that. So what does that tell us about the areas that they were going, or what people were doing in those areas? So we can assume, based on this passenger list going to Chesapeake, that there weren't a lot of families or communities, that basically there were a bunch of people working, and in this case working on farms, on plantations in the South. And that the intent of the people there wasn't to create communities or to create families. They were going there to work, specifically. Or at least that's what we can guess based on these documents. And then in New England, we can guess that about their communities, that they were full of families, some skilled workers, so you have trades going on in those communities, and that the people were going there to create communities. They were going there as families. So what we just did is exactly what historians or researchers would do to discover what life was like for people who aren't famous in history, which is the majority of people. So like 99.9% of the people in older history couldn't write, didn't keep records of themselves, and so we have to discover that through these documents. Now you're going to have a chance. You're going to have a chance to look at the same documents and draw some of your own conclusions. So again, you're doing exactly what a historian would do.